Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Penn State Homeland Security Program's webinar series. I'm excited to kick this off, this series this spring, to kick it off with a presentation by Michael Ruehle of NATO. I am Alexander Sietschlag. I am chair of Penn State Homeland Security Programs, and I'm happy to be a host. Thank you for joining. We will also be recording this meeting, as we know not everybody who had an honest intention of attending is able to do so. So we will be recording the meeting, and the presentation will be or the talk will be followed by Q&A. I would already like to invite all participants along the way now, while Mr. Ruehle is presenting, to leave their questions in the chat. I will be moderating the chat, and I will be picking 2 to 3 questions at a time. So it will be best if you leave your questions in the chat as they come up, or as they occur to them as Mr. Ruehle is speaking. Now, without further ado, I am excited to welcome and introduce Michael Ruehle of NATO, where he is currently the head of Climate and Energy Security Section in the Emerging Security Challenges Division in NATO's international staff. Previously, he was the head of the speechwriting section and senior political advisor in the NATO Secretary General's policy planning unit. Before joining NATO's international staff in 1991, when I still went to my international relations master's classes at Munich University in 1991, Mr. Ruehle was already a Volkswagen Fellow at the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung in Germany, and a visiting fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. Mr. Ruehle has published widely on international security issues in among others, Asia Times, Comparative Strategy, International Affairs, Chatham House, the Chatham House rules, hopefully. So that's quite a distinguished location for publications, obviously. Review and Parameters, that's, as you probably know, the publication out of the US Army War College, which is more or less next door from us here, in Politico, and in The World Today, among others. So like I said, I don't want to take anything more away from Dr. Ruehle's interaction time with you and your interaction time with him. With that, Mr. Ruehle, if you can please take it away. We are excited to have you, and we are very much looking forward to your talk and then to the Q&A afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Sietschlag. It's a pleasure to be here, albeit only virtually. This is actually the first time I've been asked to speak about both subjects together. Usually you do climate and then in one seminar, and then you do energy in another. And we have in fact just started to put climate into our energy courses. Of course, both subjects are very closely together. But I would be lying if I would tell you that this was the result of a master plan of NATO. We're really not into master plans. So what I will try to do is to give you very briefly the history of how these two subjects emerged, because it will also become interesting for you as students, and some of you will work in international organizations later on. What are the necessary ingredients to make a policy successful? And why is it sometimes very difficult to make a policy successful? I think you can, if you contrast energy and climate and how we handle both issues, you will see some interesting insights. I think nobody has ever done that because only an insider can do it. So I'll give you some ideas. Starting with energy security. Energy security is on NATO's agenda now for quite some time. Officially, we negotiated the first draft on an energy security paper in 2008 for the Bucharest summit that was, and it was essentially an ordeal to do. Why? Because the idea of having energy security as a distinct NATO subject was an idea that was pushed forward by the new member states at the time, i.e. the Eastern European member states, as a result of the energy crises between Russia and Ukraine to 2006, which had left a lot of Eastern Europe in the cold. And therefore, these countries felt that, now we are NATO members, and our security is severely impacted by Russian energy policy. So we think it's legitimate that NATO is looking at energy, particularly Russia, particularly gas, through the NATO lens. The Western Europeans, the old member states, were not so happy because they thought NATO is not an energy institution. So why bother? I mean, we are not, energy security. That's companies. That's governments. That's the private sector. If we get into this, then we militarize this subject, and it doesn't really help anybody. So we had two diametrically opposed positions. The result was, as I said, because we always agree at the end of the day on something, a long paper about the options of NATO in energy security. But the paper, and this is again shows that NATO is not always very smart, that paper was confidential. So we had in the summit in 2008 this strange message: yes, we are now looking into energy security, but we're not telling you how. That's not a good public relations strategy. Anyway, so we, as the international staff, basically then had the task to fill this half-hearted compromise with real serious life, and to really make sure that we develop an energy agenda that is consensual, that both groups of member states, let's say the pro and the skeptics, could actually agree on. And that's what we did over time. The international staff took quite a strong role here. Also some, of course, with the help of some individual allies who were very interested in moving that subject forward. So we developed an approach that we felt was really compatible with NATO's limited role on energy issues, but over time would probably, be enriched with additional substance, and maybe we could also use it as a springboard for reaching out to other institutions, where we felt reaching out was very important on many issues, like, for example, the European Union. And this is what we've done. We first developed a 3-pillar approach: strategic awareness, supporting critical energy infrastructure, and enhancing the energy efficiency in the military. So strategic awareness, that's, strategic analysis, intelligence sharing, political discussions among allies in committees, briefings in committees, for example, by energy companies or by governments about their energy policies. Then we pushed it further and said, why can't we have this on the council level, the North Atlantic Council, the highest political authority that meets at NATO every week. So we organized these so-called the energy NACs, the North Atlantic Council meeting, and we invited for the first time EU speakers, all the way to the EU Energy Commissioner. We invited the International Energy Agency, and this has now become a regular feature. It was highly controversial when we started it in 2014. Today we have these meetings twice a year, and they really broaden the strategic horizon, because we invite institutions like the EU that has a far greater remit on energy security than NATO has. So having a discussion, not just in a committee that nobody really cares about, but having it at the NAC level was a major breakthrough. Then we had, as I said, interesting support from others. Lithuania, which of course is very energy savvy, due to its history of skirmishes on energy with Russia. Lithuania created a center of excellence, which is like kind of a think tank, which is it really helps us a lot. We have a very small staff at NATO, but the center of excellence has a fairly large staff. So we work with them on a number of projects. So the awareness pillar became perhaps the most busy pillar. And today, in the current Russian-Ukraine crisis, when the Russians are withholding the gas, at least they're withholding a certain amount that they could otherwise sell us, these analyses, backstopping with the EU, reaching out to the IEA and say, guys, you have all the data, what's the situation like? All this is very, very helpful. The second pillar was supporting critical energy infrastructure. And here you have to say that protecting your infrastructure is your own national business. NATO is not protecting pipelines or ships, but we set up training courses. For example, we have one running in Kuwait every year on the latest technologies against cyber attacks against infrastructure, for example. We used our science program to give seed money to new scientific ideas, how to, for example, check the integrity of pipelines, so that we can make sure that our infrastructure remains in good health. We did all kinds of conferences where experts would exchange best practices on how best to ensure the protection of infrastructure and the like. And the third pillar, and that is actually what later leads you to the climate part, was military, enhancing the energy efficiency in the military. That was added by us deliberately because we thought, those nations who had it up to here to talk about Russia every day and their gas or their gas production, or their gas, using gas as a weapon or whatever. Some countries would be fed up with this. They need something that's maybe closer to home, i.e. closer to the NATO bread and butter, which is military competence. So we looked at some allies and we realized they have some pretty good stuff. Also some partner countries, like for example, Australia, Sweden, had super interesting projects on how to reduce the logistical burden of fuel supply to the military by using, for example, renewables like wind or solar, for example, in remote base camps. So we looked at what they had. We developed a science program of our own with NATO money. We showcased some of these new technologies, energy efficient technologies, at NATO exercises, so that the top brass, which comes by, sees these things and realizes, as we call it, that there are win-win solutions. You can have, through modern technologies, you can have a smaller, a lower consumption of diesel, for example, but at the same time you're not losing any combat efficiency. On the contrary, by lowering the logistical burden of bringing tons and tons of fuel, you are actually making yourself more flexible, actually. So we were looking into these win-win technologies, and that was that. And then it took about until only 2 years from now, 2 years ago. So about more than 10 years we were working on energy security, but without a climate angle. And then quite quickly and quite comprehensively, climate came onto our agenda as well. Why? Well, first of all, because I think generally there is a social, political pressure, a realization, not only since Greta Thunberg, that climate is obviously something you need to worry about, and the realization also by many military that climate change is changing your entire environment. In other words, the places where you deploy forces are changing. It's getting hotter, it's getting wetter, it's in some cases getting drier, and of course the sea level is rising, which every naval officer knows, whether he's a conservative or a liberal. You can measure certain things. You can also measure that the ice is melting in the Arctic. In the Arctic, climate change is happening about 3 times as fast as in other places in the world, and this means that you will have new waterways opening up hopefully for commercial business, but who knows, may also be part of maritime competition. And you are, of course, opening up new possibilities for exploitation of hydrocarbons, for example, in the Arctic. So there's slowly but surely a new chapter opening in economic opportunities, but also in geopolitical competition. So then, all of this is to say, things were conspiring to the point where you had to, as NATO, you had to look at that stuff. Secretary General, who had been previously the UN envoy for climate change, of course, had an open mind. And as a Norwegian, I think when you're in the north, you know that climate change is going on. You don't doubt it. So he started that process himself. He had his policy planning guys write a very good paper on climate change and the security implications and how NATO could position itself here. And then we negotiated a climate change and security action plan, which was unveiled just last year at the Brussels summit last summer. And this is was a big difference to the old energy security story, where you had 2 diametrically opposed camps, whereas here you still had, the enthusiasts who said we got to do big things on climate change, and those who said, well, cautious, this is not really mainstream NATO business. But by and large, they were singing from the same song sheet, because it was easier than on energy security, because it was a global issue. It is an issue that everybody accepts as a problem, and it is an issue where you can, much better than in energy security, develop a really systematic agenda that finds consensus within the allies. So rather than leaving it to us, to the international staff, to basically just sort of, over time develop an energy agenda, the climate agenda was negotiated in great detail and with very little controversy, actually, last year. And here we have actually 4 pillars. I'll go through very quickly to have time, leave time for Q&A. But again, we start with awareness, which means, we look at how climate change is going to change the world in which we live, meaning how does climate change our security environment? Could there be more crises because of food shortages, migration because of rising sea levels, droughts, deforestation, you name it. But also, how does it affect our own military job by, for example, creating conditions in which our military will find it harder and harder to operate. To give an example, in Afghanistan, the temperatures became so high sometimes that the turbines of helicopters were basically out of commission. In Iraq, you have temperatures over 50 degrees centigrade, which no military gear can really cope with. So the climate change is already changing the way in which the military needs to plan its operations, and over time it will also change the way in which, or the kind of equipment it needs to procure. And that brings me to the second pillar, adaptation. You need to adapt. If climate change continues and is actually accelerating, you need to adapt your military thinking, planning, exercising, procurement. You need to adapt virtually everything. And this is what we're really trying to do, to look throughout the entire NATO system, to mainstream NATO climate considerations throughout the entire NATO enterprise. That'll take years to do, but there is a serious attempt actually now to actually do that. The third, perhaps most interesting, potentially most controversial pillar is mitigation. There is I think a growing number of people who believe that climate change, mitigation of climate change, slowing down climate change, doing something about it, is not just a civilian job. It's also a job for the military. The military, let's face it, is a big polluter. We're using jet fuel, we're using tons of diesel. So we are not exactly super environmentally friendly. And isn't there a way to change that? And this is where I come back to what I said earlier about my win-win technologies. That's why our section, the energy section, became now the climate and energy section, because the people who were working out the first draft of this climate strategy remembered some of what we had done over the last 10-15 years in energy security, and said, isn't that sort of a nice bridge into the climate? If you have a camp that operates on less diesel, it also produces less greenhouse gas emissions. So you have a logistic advantage, but you also have a smaller environmental footprint. And because we were the only ones in NATO who had done stuff like that, they gave it to us. Or to put it less friendly, they imposed it on us. Because in NATO, you get a new job or a new remit, and they never bother about money, staff, or anything. They just say, okay, do it. So we got it. But anyway, as I said, the nations are very much in control of this. So mitigation means, for the time being, we're developing right now a methodology for measuring greenhouse gas emissions in the military. We have most of our allies, at least for the time being. So comparing notes with those countries that have been hit, and looking at ways how they mitigate the problem in terms of exchanging best practices, that is also something that we are looking at. We also need to reach out, of course, as we do in energy security, to the European Union, We need to reach out to the climate experts, because we don't have indigenous climate experts at NATO itself. So we have to reach out to the NGOs, to the all the institutes that do climate methodology. We want to use our own science program, for example, as we used it in energy security for some energy efficiency work. We want to use it now also for climate work. And just in a few days' time, we will start our first new project, which is a particular combination of sensors, space-based, air-based, and land-based, to improve weather data or climate data forecasting, which is of course super important for the civilians as well as for the military. So in a nutshell, this is what we're doing. This is the energy and the climate agenda. We're trying to bring it together more closely now. First, we made sure it's run in the same committee. That's always very important in NATO, so that we don't stovepipe it into different places. We try to look for synergies between the two work strands. As I said, there is already synergy in the military energy efficiency and mitigation strands, because they're doing almost the same thing. We are bringing now more environmental dimensions into our energy security courses that we have, so that we segue in our teaching. We segue from energy into climate. And of course, we also, what brings us together, both work strands very much together, is what is now known as the green transition. The idea that we are moving away from fossil fuels, both in the civilian world, but also to a degree, maybe a bit slower in the military world. And what the green transition will mean for our security. To give you just one example, we can talk about more in the Q&A. If I'm moving away from gas, that's great if I feel that Russia can no longer blackmail me, right? But if my move away from gas towards, let's say, electricity makes me dependent on lithium that I procure from China, maybe the deal is not so great after all. So we need to look at dependencies, at supply chain vulnerabilities. All of this is being done now in a much more coherent fashion than we did when it was only energy security alone. So to sum up, I think if you have all allies accepting a problem from the beginning as a problem, and also accept that NATO has a major role to play, then it's fairly easy to come up with a fairly straightforward agenda. If the allies are disagreeing over something or not sure about something, and leave it to the international staff to basically develop the details, then you will make progress, but your progress is probably more slow. So I'm very happy that the addition of climate to our agenda is also helping the energy security agenda to become more accepted and become more known, better known in NATO. So in our case, I can only say, although as I said, it wasn't a master plan, these things were 10 years apart. Climate coming 10 years after energy security, I think we can make it work because intrinsically they belong together. Thanks very much, and I think we have a lot of time for questions.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And I already have one question in the Q&A part. If the others could please join and leave the questions rather in the Q&A box than in the chat. But if you don't know where to find the Q&A box, I'm also monitoring the chat. But what we have on the chat so far is one question from John Lichty, and it's very interesting. So he is asking the following: given the limits to battery technology and the footprint in terms of physical acreage required for solar and wind, how much interest is there among NATO militaries for advanced nuclear reactors?
Very good question. There is indeed interest in some allies about it. There have been all kinds of ideas floating around. Tons of articles have been written about it. But I think there's a big difference politically in terms of acceptability of nuclear energy throughout the allies. We have countries that have phased out nuclear or are phasing it out. We have others that almost phasing in. So I think this will be quite an interesting discussion over years. Now, the if I understand correctly, and I'm not a technical expert, one of the selling points of small reactors is that they do not produce the same type of leftovers that you have to guard for about 1 million years because of their radiation. So that if that were true, I think that would be a major selling point, that they're cleaner not only when they run but also after their how do you say, the products that you have to store. But I would not argue that it will be generally accepted by all allies, but it's completely up to the allies. Because if the United States, whose military operates around the world and in very difficult situations, like for example the High North, think that a small nuclear reactor will solve part of their problems, and the same is true, I think, for some Baltic states, for example, then of course they can do that. I don't see, on the other hand, a kind of a doctrinal agreement in terms of NATO proper, but I don't think that would be necessary. Remember always one thing: when we look at energy generation, especially fuel, we have in NATO a single fuel policy. This means we have a policy that enables, let's say Americans coming to Europe in a crisis, the Danes or the Germans can immediately give them fuel, because we have sorted out who's giving what to whom and what will work and which engines and so forth. If you go to other forms of generation, like nuclear, like solar, interoperability questions pose themselves quite differently, and maybe not as strongly.
Okay, thank you. That's been insightful. So we have one more geopolitical and one more technology-related question. So maybe I'm picking the technology-related first, because that's what you've just been addressing. So, and also, as you are asking your questions, please identify yourself in one sentence. So we already know who you are because we see your name with the question, but we don't know who you are because, maybe we don't know who you are. So please say, if you are a student of ours or affiliation, whatever, just one sentence. That also makes it easier and a little kinder for Michael Ruehle, that he knows whom he's talking to. So next question: what about the use of hydrogen power, like the Toyota Mirai car in California, and then military uses for that?
I think hydrogen power is a very strong option in some areas. I'm not a technological expert, so you're asking the wrong guy. But in for example, submarines, it is a very promising technology. It can probably go to other places as well, other weapons platforms. It's a very in some allies it is seen as almost as a solution of future fuel problems. But of course, then you have to have the hydrogen also be produced green, which is not necessarily the case these days. But it seems to be one of the better options in the future, because the classical electric battery, aside from creating new dependencies, as I just said, lithium, so the classical batteries may not give you for all vehicles the kind of power that you need that diesel has, because of its high density and energy density. So yeah, hydrogen is certainly an option, but it's not yet. We're not yet there.
Thank you. The next question that I have is more geopolitical, and it comes from Tim Sevison, who also is an adjunct in our program, among other things. And so his question is: can you discuss the influence of Nord Stream pipelines on stability within the region, as well as Russia's Arctic exploration?
Nord Stream, of course, is a super controversial project, because the initial idea of Nord Stream is, of course, to circumvent Ukraine. That was the idea by the Germans and the Russians, and I think it made eminent sense at the time when it was developed, because both Russia and Germany and other countries as well, like the Netherlands and others who were part of that, felt that Ukraine was the problem child, and therefore, if you just eliminate the middleman, you can have a better relationship, and it's cheaper. You don't have to pay the Ukrainians for transit and all that stuff. Of course, this changed radically when it turned out that Russia is an even greater problem than Ukraine may have been. So now the idea of Nord Stream looks like you're isolating Ukraine to make it prey for Russia, for Russian pressure. So in a way, the changing political conditions, geopolitical conditions, have also changed the way we look at that pipeline. And I say this in addition to, you need to in the last 10 years, 15 years, things that were said about Nord Stream 1 or Nord Stream 2, you must never forget there's always also an economic competition element in there. So if other countries say, oh, Nord Stream is bad, watch out what their pipeline projects are. But Nord Stream is a good example of an issue that has gained now enormous significance. The Germans for a long time would argue, well, it's just an economic project. So, it's not our business. It's just the companies who are doing it. But I think nobody really believed that. And it was a few years ago when Chancellor Merkel was saying, no, of course, there's a geopolitics element to it. But it took the Germans a long time to admit that. So where are we standing now? I mean, that President Biden was very clear about Nord Stream. If the Russians would indeed invade Ukraine, Nord Stream is dead. Chancellor Scholz did not say it exactly like that. The assumption is he wants to avoid to mention the term Nord Stream because of regress of compensation you would have to pay to industry if the German government would can this project. But I think if the Russians would really do what we are afraid they might still be doing, then this pipeline is dead. But then, of course, you have and we already have right now a bit of a problem in energy supply to Europe, because the Russians are diminishing the supply through Ukraine, almost zero through Ukraine. Even Nord Stream 1 is carrying less gas. So we are now scrambling, and to some degree successful, to get gas from additional gas from our other suppliers. US, biggest supplier now of liquefied natural gas to Europe, followed by Qatar. We actually, the Secretary General called President Aliyev of Azerbaijan a few days ago, asking him to step up, ramp up production of gas to Europe. So we are already looking now towards alternative suppliers in case the Russians are difficult, and if Nord Stream 1 would be 2, sorry, Nord Stream 2 would be killed, then you have to find other ways. Just a general point: indigenous production in Europe is going down, and it will continue to go down. So we need to import more. If we phase out nuclear power, as we've done in Germany and in Austria and other places, gas consumption will go up because it's the substitute in a way for nuclear power for the time being. So, I mean, something's got to give. You have to find a formula where you get less dependent on Russian gas, some would say Russian blackmail through gas, but at the same time, you need to get the stuff somewhere else. And the advantage of Russian gas was, that's why the Germans were so attached to it, it used to be quite reliable and it used to be quite cheap. So because the pipelines had been around for 30, 40 years, they were paid for, today building a new LNG port or the ships or the regasification, that all costs a lot of money. You have to invest a lot first before you then can enjoy enhanced energy security. But I think we're getting there. I think the Russia will realize that some of the policies it has conducted over the last years were actually also economically counterproductive.
Thank you. Any more questions? So this is your chance. Currently, I see nothing in the chat or the Q&A, but you could certainly go ahead and let's see. In the meantime, do you think that those new policy areas and the way they are dealt with at NATO, and also thank you for sharing a little bit of the policy process related to that. Do you think that is going to change the decision-making structure, decision-making model in the Council or in NATO overall over the time being, to for the time for the future? Is that going to be a driver also of organizational and procedural change, those exploration and adoption of new policy areas?
I think the answer is no. There can be no change of the unanimity rule. Why? Well, because NATO consists of 30 countries, some big, but most of them small. If you change to majority voting, you would run the risk that you steamroll the small ones into submission. And I think that's exactly why they won't yield. There was also a interesting episode. This was around the time of the Iraq War, 2002-3, when some Americans were angry about the Germans, the Belgians, the French, because they were, hesitant, and they would stop certain processes in NATO, at least for a while. And I talked to a lot of American think tankers, to some politicians as well, and they said, well, can't we just sort of circumvent these naysayers by going to majority voting? And I said, so yeah, in theory, yes, but what do you do if you are in the minority? And for Americans, this was too much. And the idea that they may be overruled by a majority of Europeans was frightening. Not likely in practice, probably, but it immediately ended this discussion, because this discussion is always, when you go through a discussion like that, always think what happens if you are in the minority. Then you don't like this process at all. So that's, I think, why we all stick with the clumsy rule of unanimity, but it has two advantages. One is, because you need to agree, you work on agreement. You want to agree, because you have to. So you will work day and night to get a compromise. And the second advantage is, once you have this decision, then you know for sure that all allies are behind it and implementing it. And I think that's a very strong value in today's world, where we deal, with autocratic competition and so forth. If you have 30 countries, saying, okay, this is our position, we stand by it. Imagine if we have, this is our position, but 1/3 doesn't agree with it. That doesn't quite sound so impressive. So there are many reasons for staying with the current course. You need to make some adjustments in order not to go completely crazy with having ever more countries and ever longer discussion times in the council. So a couple of years ago, for example, we introduced can't remember now, 2 or 3 minute rule in the council. So there's a like a stopwatch. So if you start talking, you know how long you still have time, how much time you still have. That doesn't, of course, deter some ambassadors from speaking twice as long, even if the thing is blinking red. But I think it has a discipline effect on the group overall, to really come to the point, cut to the chase. And there are many other things like that, which try to square the circle of a large number of sovereign nation states, coming to an agreement on sometimes very controversial issues. So far, I would say it works. I think so far, the bigger NATO, the post-Cold War NATO, has taken some more tricky decisions together than the old NATO in the Cold War ever had to do.
Thank you. That's been insightful. And I think, let me see, I am getting confused with my many boxes here. There was, I think, one question came in. Let me see a second. Yeah. No, it actually didn't. So something beeped, but obviously it was none of you. But if any of you still have a question, would you care to share it right now? That would be great.
Well, they want to enjoy their lunch break, obviously.
Yeah, it's right. It's between 12 and 1, but it's fantastic. It's a great turnout, and we were over 30 during your talk before Q&A, and then some people were in a hurry and had to leave, so that's perfect. Any comments? You can also, if it's not a question, you can also throw your opinion at Mr. Ruehle and ask for a diplomatic response if you want.
I'm not known for diplomatic responses, actually.
I know, but they could ask for it and then see what they get, right? So otherwise, everything we seem to be good, but don't go yet, because we've got a little token of appreciation for you. 1 second. There we go.
Oh, I just realized I forgot to mention Arctic, because in the question on Nord Stream was also Russia's Arctic exploration.
Yeah, maybe you want to briefly touch on that, because
actually,
I know with the focus of US Northcom and everything, that
yes,
Arctic shift that could be of interest in particular to our audience here. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I think there's an interesting question when you look at the north, that the Russians, while they are quite ambitious for their economic exploitation of the region, they are also using or deploying quite a lot of military hardware in the region, but their posture in the Arctic is not as intimidating as it is in some parts of Europe. And I think the Russians here have understood, perhaps better than in other parts of Europe, that in order to have a exploration of the riches of the Arctic, you need a stable and peaceful environment. And they are still, I think, more willing to invest in this. Also, as current chairman of the Arctic Circle, where they have a very ambitious program, that gives me some hope that the Russians will still understand that a peaceful environment, trade-offs, economic benefits for everybody is still a better deal than the kind of zero-sum game logic that you find them sometimes applying in other areas. So the high north is the exploitation of resources is a very interesting opportunity for Russia, given their enormously long coastline. But at the same time, and this brings me to climate change again, their coastline, their northern coastline is weakening due to permafrost thaw, and a large part of Russia is actually built on permafrost. And if that thaws because of global warming, then Russia will be in enormous trouble. And Russia already had problems with infrastructure because it was breaking, because it was the permafrost. It was built on permafrost. They had oil spills, very significant oil spills. So for the Russians, this is an opportunity, but also a tremendous challenge. We also realized that, I mean, after Crimea, after annexation of Crimea, part of the sanctions were directed at Russian technology, or at technology, Western technologies that the Russians wanted to have to exploit resources in the Arctic. So that's another problem. If they don't behave in a cooperative way in Europe, and the West basically does not give them the technology they want, and assuming China will not chip in, then I think Russia will be in a really difficult situation. So I would hope that the High North, the cooperation in the High North, which is still happening, despite the military exercises and so forth, cooperation in the High North remains a model that could hopefully be applied to other parts of the planet as well, because this is where the Russians are still seemingly working in a different mode than they're working, let's say, around Ukraine.
Thank you for that perspective. And in the meantime, another question has come in. It's from one of our alums, Michael Ocasto, who is currently working as a consultant with the National Nuclear Security Administration, or NNSA. And his question is, do you anticipate potential cyber threats with NATO's energy security?
There's no need to anticipate because it's already happening. I think the largest percentage of cyber attacks are against energy networks. That is indeed a problem. So far, they haven't been catastrophic, but the problem here is NATO is an intergovernmental organization. We don't have jurisdiction to go to, let's say, an energy company and say, hey, we look at your cyber stuff, it's not good enough, put more money in. This is tricky because today, unlike in the Cold War, NATO is relying with its military assets very much on civilian stuff. I mean, when I was a young boy in the 60s, and tanks need to be transported by railway, the railway belonged to the state. So the government could say, okay, we want this and this to happen, and it would happen. Today, the railways are mostly in private hands. So you have to negotiate with the railway because the railway will say, well, we have 6 other contracts here that we have to fulfill, and you're the 7th in line. In a crisis, that's not good enough. So this whole problem of how do we interact with the private sector on energy, on transportation, on cyber, has to be reviewed. And what we're trying to do is to talk to the private sector to make the private sector more sensitive to the challenges, particularly of cyber attacks, because there's no conflict today that does not have a cyber dimension. Ukraine is being hammered, and the Ukrainian energy sector is being hammered all the time with cyber attacks. What can NATO do more directly? Instead of just saying, watch out. We have, for example, done 2 major exercises with Ukraine called Coherent Resilience, one in 17 and one in 21. And we basically brought lots of experts over there. They interacted with the experts from the government mainly based in Kiev. And they were looking at legislation, for example. What happens if a cyber attack knocks out the electricity grid? Who has to talk to whom? What kind of next steps are necessary? How can we rebuild the grid fast? These exercises were organized in part by us, in part by, and I mentioned this earlier, the Energy Security Center of Excellence in Lithuania, in part by the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey over at your place. So we brought experts from all the regions under the sun over to Kiev, and in the end, based on the results of the exercise, it was about a 1-week thing. The Ukrainians integrated some of the results into the national legislation on energy security. So you have a best practice exchange, if you will, in this case with a very vulnerable energy transit country, a partner country, not a member country, but a partner country to NATO. And when you cannot help them with military means, at least you can help them become more resilient. And I think that whole notion of resilience, also in answer to your question, resilience will become, and you will see this in a new strategic concept which will come out in the summer, resilience will become a far more important catchword in NATO than in the past, simply because this idea that if you're strong militarily, others will leave you alone is no longer true if that other, the bad guy, can hit you without using tanks or missiles, and hits you by cyber, and hits you by fake news campaigns, and hits you by all kinds of hybrid things. So we have to have a look at how we interact with the private sector and other players in a completely new way. I think we're doing quite well. We started with cyber because it was the most obvious, but I think we should also expand our dialogue with the private sector on other issues, all in this logic that if I want to be more resilient, I need to have in place strong ties with the private sector. As the saying goes, it takes a network to defeat a network, and we have to build our own strong network to cope with attacks against energy infrastructure, attacks against cyber attacks against our parliaments. We need to cope with this together. It's a national responsibility to make sure that your own cyber stuff is in order, but you will do better if you have a vibrant exchange of best practices with your allies.
Great, thank you. Maybe I can follow up on that with the last question, unless anything else comes up here. So since you mentioned the work on the upcoming new strategic concept, and then considering what you just commented on, and considering the new threat and risk environment with climate and energy. So how would you see the relationship, or how would you see the deterrence versus resilience, or the deterrence resilience continuum in NATO's future, and as far as you're able to comment on in the emerging new strategic concept?
Well, the negotiations haven't started yet, so all I can draw from is conceptual papers that have been written by various parts of the House on various things like resilience, like hybrid, like climate. So far, I would say the new concept will look different from the 2010 concept in several ways. It will have a much stronger focus on resilience, on hybrid. It will mention China, which the old one did not mention. It will mention Russia, but not in as nice words as it did in 2010 when Russia was our friend. It will, there will be a couple of other things. It will probably tone down the crisis management function of NATO after Afghanistan. That's, I think, not surprising. But it will still keep the old structure, I think, of the three core tasks: collective defense, crisis management, and cooperation, partnership. Resilience, some people thought resilience should become a fourth core task. But I think the problem here is, as I said in my answer to the question, we don't have the jurisdiction to tell a company you need to do this or that. The EU is in a better position. They can produce laws which the companies need to adhere to. But NATO remains an organization of sovereign nation states. So we don't like others to talk into our own affairs. You know, we accept it in the EU framework, but not in the NATO framework. So that's why I think resilience can't be really a convincing new core tasks. It is roughly, in my view, it goes across the three other core tasks. We need more resilience in all three other core tasks to be to do collective defense. Because if your shiny military is knocked out by a cyber attack, collective defense is over. Same with crisis management. And I think we also need to help our partners in our third corporate security pillar to be more resilient, because they too are, as I said with Ukraine, are victims of cyber attacks. So resilience goes across the three core tasks without being a fourth core task in itself. But other than that, I don't know much more yet. The first draft, there's no first draft, but a paper that was written recently as a discussion paper had, I think, climate mentioned more often than Russia. And I think some allies will say, guys, that's a bit over the top. But it shows to you how this new work strand has taken on in terms of importance. And climate change is a major problem for all of mankind. So I'm as curious as you are to see the final version in Madrid. I will not have time to be part of that discussion. I will negotiate the climate change progress report and the energy security progress report. Maybe one day we can merge them into one, but it'll be a lot of hectic activity before the summit.
So thank you and best wishes for that. And as I indicated, we can't let you go without a little token of appreciation. So that is a little certificate that we'd like to award to you. I'll send it via email. And thank you so much for giving us your time to talk to us. Also, thank you for your candid and frank remarks. Appreciate that very much. That was very insightful for our audience. I would like to thank everybody for joining. Have a good afternoon, evening, wherever you are, whatever you are. Stay safe. Thanks again, Michael Ruehle. That's been exciting. I'm glad we had a chance to catch up and to catch you for this webinar. And I hope we can do something like that in a not too distant future again. And thanks again. And
with pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye. Bye.